The Cleveland Browns quarterback battle has already become one of the most uncomfortable stories in football, and not because of what's happening on the field. The uncomfortable part is watching how quickly people decided they already knew the ending before the real competition even started. Somehow, after only a few days of voluntary minicamp practices, with no pads, no live pressure, and no meaningful stakes, an entire narrative exploded across sports media, claiming that Deshaun Watson had already taken control while Shedeur Sanders was supposedly falling behind. And the strangest part? Most of that narrative didn't even match what coaches were actually saying. That's what makes this story feel different. This isn't normal off-season hype. This feels like something else entirely. Because when you slow everything down and actually look at the details, the public version of events starts falling apart almost immediately. Reports started circulating that Shedeur looked overwhelmed. Some analysts hinted he might not even secure the backup role. Others pushed the idea that Cleveland already trusted Watson far more behind the scenes. And within hours, those opinions started spreading everywhere as if they were undeniable facts. But here's the problem nobody wants to admit. Almost none of those conclusions were based on real football evaluation. These were walkthrough practices, installation sessions, the kind of off-season workouts where coaches are mostly teaching terminology, testing communication, and introducing the structure of the offense. There were no defenders flying around, no live pass rush collapsing the pocket, no real game-speed decision-making. Yet somehow, the reaction coming out of Cleveland sounded like people had just witnessed a full regular season collapse from a rookie quarterback. And once those early impressions hit social media, the momentum became impossible to stop. What makes this even more fascinating is that Todd Monken himself tried to calm everything down almost immediately. He openly described the practices as a 40,000-foot overview. He explained that rotations were constantly changing. He even clarified that certain periods were heavily focused on the run game, naturally limiting quarterback opportunities depending on the script. That context matters. In some practice periods, a quarterback could appear almost invisible simply because the script wasn't designed around passing reps at all.
But that part of the story didn't spread nearly as fast as the dramatic headlines did. Instead, social media locked onto a completely different image. Watson was presented as the experienced veteran reclaiming his authority inside the building. Shedeur became the rookie trying to survive. And because people repeated that version over and over again, it slowly started feeling true regardless of the actual evidence. That's how modern sports narratives work now. Repetition becomes validation, confidence becomes credibility, and before long, speculation starts sounding indistinguishable from fact. What's even more interesting is that several of the details that could have balanced the conversation barely received attention at all. Monken himself reportedly mentioned that Shedeur Sanders actually led first-team 11-on-11 drills on the opening day. He also clarified that Sanders received a large amount of total reps overall due to the structure of practice rotations. But those facts didn't fit the dominant storyline developing online, so they quietly disappeared into the background while the falling behind narrative exploded. And honestly, that may be the most revealing part of this entire situation. The evidence didn't create the conclusion already existed first. People entered this quarterback battle expecting Shedeur Sanders to struggle, expecting Watson to remain protected by the organization, expecting the rookie to be overwhelmed by the NFL environment. So when a few selective observations surfaced, they were instantly stitched together into a narrative that many were already emotionally prepared to believe. That's why this story feels bigger than football, because once labels like third string get attached to a young quarterback this early, they begin shaping public perception before the player ever gets a real opportunity to define himself. Fans start looking at every rep differently. Analysts begin grading throws through a predetermined lens. Every incompletion feels larger, every mistake gets amplified. Meanwhile, positive moments barely register because they conflict with the established storyline. And the craziest part? The real competition hadn't even started yet. But while the media debate kept spiraling louder, something happened away from cameras that revealed a completely different side of Shedeur Sanders altogether. The most fascinating part of this entire situation might be the gap between what Todd Monken actually said and what people decided to hear. Because when you go back and carefully examine his comments, the tone is completely different from the panic that exploded online afterward. In reality, Monken sounded like a coach trying to slow everyone down. The media reactions sounded like people trying to accelerate the drama as fast as possible. From the beginning, Monken framed those practices exactly the way experienced coaches usually do in April. He described them as a broad introduction phase, a teaching environment, a chance to establish language, timing, structure, and communication across the offense. That 40,000-foot overview comment wasn't accidental. He was practically telling reporters not to turn temporary offseason reps into permanent conclusions. But somehow that warning got buried underneath louder headlines claiming the quarterback hierarchy was already becoming obvious. And this is where the details become extremely important. Monken reportedly explained that the practice structure itself created misleading optics. Certain periods focused heavily on the run game, which naturally reduced visible passing reps depending on which quarterback happened to rotate into that segment. In other words, someone watching only portions of practice could easily walk away with a distorted impression of who was getting opportunities. That matters because so much of the early narrative was built almost entirely on visual perception rather than meaningful evaluation. Then came the part that should have changed the entire conversation. Monken openly stated that Shedeur Sanders actually led first-team 11-on-11 drills. Not only that, but he also explained that Sanders received a significant number of overall reps throughout the sessions. That alone should have immediately complicated the buried on the depth chart storyline. But strangely, those details rarely became the focus of discussion. Instead, the reporting kept circling back to vague observations about command, presence, and veteran control. Now, to be fair, nobody is saying Watson looked bad. That's not the point here. Reports did indicate that Watson looked comfortable and experienced within the offense, which should surprise absolutely nobody considering how long he's been in the league. The issue is the way those observations suddenly transformed into sweeping declarations about Shedeur Sanders supposedly falling dramatically behind after essentially glorified walkthrough practices. That leap in logic is where things started feeling strange. Because once certain narratives catch fire in sports media, nuance disappears instantly. The public rarely consumes full press conferences anymore. Most people see clipped headlines, short social media posts, or recycled talking points repeated across television segments. So when the phrase "Shedeur struggling to keep up" entered the cycle, it spread much faster than Monken's actual explanations about rep distribution and practice design. And after enough repetition, people stopped questioning whether the conclusion was even supported by evidence at all.
What makes this especially important is that quarterback evaluations are incredibly fragile early in a player's career. Public perception can harden fast. Once analysts begin describing a young quarterback as overwhelmed or behind schedule, every future moment starts getting interpreted through that lens. A simple incompletion suddenly confirms the criticism. A quiet practice becomes proof of regression. Meanwhile, positive signs get dismissed as exceptions rather than indicators of growth. And honestly, some fans started noticing that imbalance almost immediately. Online discussions began filling with questions about why certain details were being amplified while others were quietly ignored. Why did the third-string speculation dominate headlines while Monken's clarification about first-team reps barely circulated? Why were temporary walkthrough observations treated like final evaluations? And perhaps most importantly, why did it feel like some people were emotionally invested in Shedeur Sanders failing before the real competition had even begun? That question became impossible to ignore because the deeper this story went, the more it started feeling less like football analysis and more like narrative construction. Certain images were clearly more appealing than others. The veteran reclaiming control, the rookie struggling under pressure, the high-profile prospect getting humbled early. Those storylines generate attention. They spread quickly.
And once they become emotionally satisfying to audiences, correcting them becomes incredibly difficult. But away from the cameras and the non-stop debate, Shedeur Sanders quietly made a decision during the offseason that may reveal far more about his mindset than any minicamp headline ever could. What happened in Miami during the offseason may have revealed far more about Shedeur Sanders than anything fans saw during Brown's minicamp. Because while debates were exploding online about depth charts, locker room hierarchy, and whether he was already falling behind, Shedeur was doing something far less glamorous and probably far more important. He was working completely out of sight. No cameras, no interviews, no carefully edited social media clips designed to go viral. Just early morning training sessions before most people were even awake. And honestly, that matters more than people realize. In today's football culture, especially for a player with Shedeur's level of attention, almost everything becomes content. Every throw gets posted, every workout becomes a highlight package, every off-season drill turns into branding. But according to reports surrounding that Miami session, this wasn't that kind of environment at all. This was private work. And then something happened that unexpectedly exposed exactly where Shedeur's mindset really is right now. A content creator reportedly recognized him during one of those training sessions and approached him about filming some throws for social media. On the surface, that probably sounds harmless. Most athletes would gladly take the extra exposure, especially a young quarterback in the middle of a heated competition where public perception is already becoming part of the battle. Positive clips could have instantly spread online. Fans would have reposted them everywhere, sports pages would have amplified the hype, it would have been easy attention. But Shedeur's response completely changed the tone of the story. "You see a football in my hands right now?" That was reportedly the first thing he said back. Short, direct, no performance, no attempt to play to the cameras. And the deeper meaning hit a lot harder than people expected, because what he was really saying was simple. This isn't entertainment for him right now. This isn't content season. This is survival season. There's a mini-camp coming. There's a training camp coming. There's a real quarterback competition waiting for him inside one of the most heavily scrutinized organizations in football. And whether people admit it or not, Shedeur Sanders understands exactly what he's walking into. He knows the noise surrounding him. He knows people are questioning whether he belongs. He knows some analysts already seem eager to label him as overhyped before he's even taken meaningful NFL snaps. And instead of feeding the attention machine around him, he reportedly chose to go back to work. That detail stuck with a lot of people because it directly clashes with one of the biggest criticisms often thrown at him online. There's been this ongoing perception from some corners of football media that Shedeur is too focused on celebrity culture, branding, or attention because of the spotlight surrounding his family name. But moments like this paint a completely different picture. They suggest someone fully aware of the pressure closing in around him and completely locked onto preparation instead of performance theater. And honestly, the timing makes the story even more significant, because this is the exact moment when it would be easiest for a young quarterback to chase validation publicly. Think about the environment surrounding him right now. Reports questioning his standing in the quarterback room are already circulating. Fans are debating whether the Browns truly believe in him. Social media narratives are forming daily. Under those conditions, most young players would desperately want positive clips online to shift momentum back in their favor. Instead, reports suggest Shedeur chose invisibility. That's rare.
Especially when you understand what's at stake. This isn't just a normal rookie trying to make a roster. This is a quarterback entering a franchise carrying enormous financial baggage, public controversy, and non-stop pressures surrounding the Deshaun Watson situation. Every move is going to be analyzed. Every practice throw will become a headline. Every facial expression on the sideline will spark speculation. And despite all of that noise, the Miami story suggests Shedeur's focus right now is much narrower than people assumed. Footwork, timing, processing, preparation, the unglamorous parts. And in some ways, that mindset may actually explain why certain people inside football circles continue defending him despite all the outside skepticism. Coaches and veterans notice those details.
They notice who works when nobody's watching. They notice who stays disciplined when attention becomes distracting. And sometimes, the habits built in empty off-season workouts become far more revealing than anything happening during heavily covered public practices. But as admirable as that mentality may be, there's another reality hanging over this entire situation that makes the challenge even more complicated. Because no matter how hard Shedeur works, there's still one massive obstacle quietly shaping everything around him in Cleveland. And that obstacle comes with a $46 million price tag. The biggest challenge facing Shedeur Sanders may have nothing to do with football ability at all. It may be the simple reality that the Cleveland Browns are financially tied to Deshaun Watson in a way that completely changes the emotional dynamics of this quarterback competition. Because once a franchise commits that kind of money to a player, the situation stops being purely about performance. It becomes about justification, reputation, organizational survival. And whether people want to admit it or not, that pressure changes everything. The Browns still owe Watson an enormous amount of guaranteed money. That financial commitment doesn't disappear just because another quarterback starts generating excitement. The contract remains attached to the franchise no matter what happens on the field. And when organizations make investments that massive, there's often an invisible pressure to prove the decision wasn't a mistake. Not publicly, not officially, but internally, everyone understands it exists. That's where this story becomes incredibly uncomfortable. Because even if gene coaches genuinely want an open competition, human nature starts creeping into the equation. Executives want validation, front offices want redemption, ownership wants reassurance that years of criticism weren't justified. And sometimes, without anybody openly admitting it, organizations begin leaning toward the outcome that protects them from embarrassment rather than the one that creates the clearest future. Fans online have already started speculating about this possibility. Some believe the Browns may feel pressure to keep Watson heavily involved simply because moving away from him too quickly would force the franchise to publicly confront the reality of the contract situation. To be clear, there's no confirmed evidence proving that's happening behind closed doors, but the speculation exists because the financial weight surrounding Watson is impossible to ignore. And honestly, history shows this kind of pressure happens across sports all the time. The higher the investment, the longer organizations tend to hold on. Not always because the player is still the best option, but because admitting failure becomes emotionally and politically expensive. Nobody wants to be remembered for making one of the worst financial decisions in franchise history, so instead of cutting ties quickly, teams often convince themselves they just need more time, more reps, more patience, one more season, one more opportunity for things to finally click. That's why this situation feels so complicated for Shedeur Sanders specifically, because every rep Watson takes isn't just a football decision, it's tied to organizational optics. Every practice period becomes connected to a much larger conversation about whether Cleveland can salvage its biggest gamble. And for a young quarterback trying to prove himself, competing against that kind of institutional gravity is incredibly difficult. Talent alone doesn't automatically overcome financial commitment. Sometimes the battle becomes psychological before it even becomes athletic. What makes the Miami training story even more powerful in hindsight is that Shedeur appears to understand this reality already. He knows attention won't win him the job, viral clips won't win him the job, headlines won't win him the job. The only thing that can eventually cut through that kind of pressure is undeniable performance over time. That's why his decision to stay locked into quiet off-season work matters so much. It suggests he understands the scale of the challenge in front of him. And honestly, you can almost feel the tension building around the entire organization already, because the Browns are standing between two completely different timelines right now. One timeline is tied to the past, the massive contract, the expectations, the need to justify years of decisions surrounding Watson. The other timeline points toward the future, a younger quarterback, a fresh storyline, a possible reset for a franchise desperate to move into a new era. And the uncomfortable truth is that those two directions may eventually collide head-on. The hardest part for Cleveland may be admitting when that moment arrives. especially when you understand what's at stake. This isn't just a normal rookie trying to make a roster. This is a quarterback entering a franchise carrying enormous financial baggage, public controversy, and non-stop pressures surrounding the Deshaun Watson situation. Every move is going to be analyzed. Every practice throw will become a headline. Every facial expression on the sideline will spark speculation. And despite all of that noise, the Miami story suggests Shedeur's focus right now is much narrower than people assumed. Footwork, timing, processing, preparation, the unglamorous parts. And in some ways, that mindset may actually explain why certain people inside football circles continue defending him despite all the outside skepticism. Coaches and veterans notice those details. They notice who works when nobody's watching. They notice who stays disciplined when attention becomes distracting. And sometimes, the habits built in empty off-season workouts become far more revealing than anything happening during heavily covered public practices. But as admirable as that mentality may be, there's another reality hanging over this entire situation that makes the challenge even more complicated. Because no matter how hard Shedeur works, there's still one massive obstacle quietly shaping everything around him in Cleveland. And that obstacle comes with a $46 million price tag. The biggest challenge facing Shedeur Sanders may have nothing to do with football ability at all. It may be the simple reality that the Cleveland Browns are financially tied to Deshaun Watson in a way that completely changes the emotional dynamics of this quarterback competition. Because once a franchise commits that kind of money to a player, the situation stops being purely about performance. It becomes about justification, reputation, organizational survival. And whether people want to admit it or not, that pressure changes everything. The Browns still owe Watson an enormous amount of guaranteed money. That financial commitment doesn't disappear just because another quarterback starts generating excitement. The contract remains attached to the franchise no matter what happens on the field. And when organizations make investments that massive, there's often an invisible pressure to prove the decision wasn't a mistake. Not publicly, not officially, but internally, everyone understands it exists. That's where this story becomes incredibly uncomfortable. Because even if gene coaches genuinely want an open competition, human nature starts creeping into the equation. Executives want validation, front offices want redemption, ownership wants reassurance that years of criticism weren't justified. And sometimes, without anybody openly admitting it, organizations begin leaning toward the outcome that protects them from embarrassment rather than the one that creates the clearest future. Fans online have already started speculating about this possibility. Some believe the Browns may feel pressure to keep Watson heavily involved simply because moving away from him too quickly would force the franchise to publicly confront the reality of the contract situation. To be clear, there's no confirmed evidence proving that's happening behind closed doors, but the speculation exists because the financial weight surrounding Watson is impossible to ignore. And honestly, history shows this kind of pressure happens across sports all the time. The higher the investment, the longer organizations tend to hold on. Not always because the player is still the best option, but because admitting failure becomes emotionally and politically expensive. Nobody wants to be remembered for making one of the worst financial decisions in franchise history, so instead of cutting ties quickly, teams often convince themselves they just need more time, more reps, more patience, one more season, one more opportunity for things to finally click. That's why this situation feels so complicated for Shedeur Sanders specifically, because every rep Watson takes isn't just a football decision, it's tied to organizational optics. Every practice period becomes connected to a much larger conversation about whether Cleveland can salvage its biggest gamble. And for a young quarterback trying to prove himself, competing against that kind of institutional gravity is incredibly difficult. Talent alone doesn't automatically overcome financial commitment. Sometimes the battle becomes psychological before it even becomes athletic. What makes the Miami training story even more powerful in hindsight is that Shedeur appears to understand this reality already. He knows attention won't win him the job, viral clips won't win him the job, headlines won't win him the job. The only thing that can eventually cut through that kind of pressure is undeniable performance over time. That's why his decision to stay locked into quiet off-season work matters so much. It suggests he understands the scale of the challenge in front of him. And honestly, you can almost feel the tension building around the entire organization already, because the Browns are standing between two completely different timelines right now. One timeline is tied to the past, the massive contract, the expectations, the need to justify years of decisions surrounding Watson. The other timeline points toward the future, a younger quarterback, a fresh storyline, a possible reset for a franchise desperate to move into a new era. And the uncomfortable truth is that those two directions may eventually collide head-on. The hardest part for Cleveland may be admitting when that moment arrives.
Because once a franchise starts prioritizing financial optics over long-term development, the consequences can quietly become enormous. Quarterback growth windows are fragile. Young players need reps, coaching attention, and real opportunities under pressure. Those developmental moments can't simply be saved for later. Lost time matters. Delayed evaluation matters. And if the Browns hesitate too long because of sunk cost thinking, they risk creating a situation where the future gets sacrificed, trying to protect the past. That's why so many fans reacted strongly when a respected Cleveland voice finally said out loud what others were only hinting at behind the scenes. And when Josh Cribbs entered the conversation, the entire debate suddenly became impossible to ignore. When Josh Cribbs finally spoke about the Shedeur Sanders situation, it hit differently than the usual sports debate. This wasn't some national analyst trying to create a viral segment. This wasn't a hot take artist chasing attention for clicks. This was one of the most respected figures Cleveland fans have had in the modern era of Browns football. And when someone with that kind of credibility starts questioning how a young quarterback is being evaluated, people listen. Because Josh Cribbs understands Cleveland in a way outsiders never fully will. He lived through the chaos, the instability, the constant cycle of hope collapsing into frustration. He earned respect inside that city by giving everything he had to the organization, even during years when the franchise itself often looked completely lost. That's why his words carry weight emotionally. Browns fans don't hear Josh Cribbs as a media personality. They hear him as someone who understands what this team has repeatedly done to quarterbacks over the years. And his message was surprisingly direct. Cribbs essentially said he wants Shedeur Sanders to receive a real opportunity, a genuine evaluation, not a symbolic competition where the outcome is quietly leaning in one direction before camp even starts. He wants to see what Sanders looks like with a coaching staff fully invested in his development and a structure designed to help him grow instead of survive. And honestly, that comment resonated immediately because many fans already feared the opposite might be happening. What makes Cribbs' perspective especially interesting is that he wasn't pretending Shedeur enters a perfect situation. In fact, he seemed to acknowledge how difficult the environment around the rookie already is. The Browns are still carrying pressure from the Watson era. The organization remains under a microscope nationally. Every quarterback conversation instantly becomes emotionally charged, and into that chaos walks a young player already dealing with enormous expectations because of his name, his visibility, and the non-stop attention surrounding him. That's not exactly an easy developmental environment. Cribbs also touched on something many people outside Cleveland overlook completely. Young quarterbacks don't develop in isolation. Situation matters, infrastructure matters, stability matters, coaches matter, supporting personnel matters, and fans have seen countless talented players across the league struggle simply because the environment around them was broken from the start. That's part of why some supporters believe Shedeur deserves patience before people rush to define what he is or isn't capable of becoming at the NFL level. And perhaps the most important thing Cribbs indirectly challenged was the imbalance in public perception between Sanders and Watson. Because if you really step back and examine the national conversation, the contrast becomes hard to ignore.
Watson is often discussed as the veteran trying to reclaim his form, someone deserving time and patience to rediscover himself after injuries and setbacks. Meanwhile, Shedeur, the rookie with barely any meaningful NFL experience yet, is already being dissected like a disappointment after voluntary practices in April. That difference in framing hasn't gone unnoticed by fans. Some have openly questioned why Sanders seems to face such immediate skepticism, while Watson continues receiving the benefit of long-term belief despite years of inconsistency and uncertainty surrounding his situation. Again, those are fan reactions and online discussions, not confirmed realities inside the building. But the perception gap is real enough that people like Cribbs felt compelled to speak publicly about fairness and development. And then he mentioned something that instantly reopened old scars for Browns fans everywhere: Baker Mayfield. The second that comparison entered the conversation, the entire emotional temperature changed completely. Because for Browns fans, Baker's story still feels unfinished emotionally. It's one of those situations that people in Cleveland still debate years later, because deep down, nobody is completely sure the organization handled it correctly, and that's exactly why the comparison hits so hard.
At one point, Baker Mayfield was supposed to be the answer. He brought energy back to a franchise that had spent years drowning in instability. He played through injuries. He helped snap Cleveland's playoff drought. He gave fans moments they genuinely believed could lead somewhere meaningful. And for a brief stretch, it actually felt like the Browns were finally building something stable around a quarterback who embraced the city completely. Then, everything changed fast. The organization grew impatient, criticism intensified, injuries complicated the evaluation process, public narratives started turning against him. And before long, the Browns made one of the most aggressive quarterback pivots in recent NFL history by fully committing to Deshaun Watson. At the time, many people defended the move as necessary. Watson was viewed as the more talented quarterback on paper. The Browns believed they were upgrading the position dramatically. But now, years later, the emotional aftermath of that decision looks far more complicated. Because while Cleveland struggled through instability, injuries, and non-stop controversy surrounding Watson, Baker Mayfield quietly rebuilt his career elsewhere. He found a new environment, a fresh coaching situation, a franchise willing to believe in him again. And suddenly, the same quarterback many people claimed was finished started looking functional, confident, and dangerous all over again. That reality still bothers a lot of Browns fans. Not necessarily because Baker became perfect, but because his resurgence forced people to reconsider whether Cleveland gave up too quickly in the first place. And that's why Cribbs mentioning him now feels almost symbolic. He wasn't just talking about Baker, he was talking about a pattern, a fear that the Browns may once again allow pressure, optics, and impatience to cloud their long-term judgment at quarterback. And honestly, when you compare the emotional dynamics between the two situations, some parallels become impossible to ignore. Once again, there's a young quarterback entering the building with massive expectations and enormous public attention. Once again, outside narratives are already shaping perception before meaningful games are even played. Once again, the franchise finds itself balancing immediate pressure against long-term development. And once again, there's a risk that organizational urgency could overpower patience before the full picture has time to develop naturally. That's the warning Cribbs seemed to be hinting at. Because quarterback development is rarely linear. Young players struggle, they adjust, they evolve. Some need stability before their talent fully surfaces. Others need time before the speed of the NFL slows down mentally. But when franchises start making emotional decisions too early, especially decisions influenced by public criticism or pressure to justify previous moves, they sometimes create the exact failure they were trying to avoid in the first place. And there's another uncomfortable layer underneath all of this. The Browns don't just need Watson to succeed football-wise. In many ways, they need the Watson decision itself to feel defensible historically. That's a massive psychological burden for any organization.
It's hard to fully embrace a new direction when doing so indirectly forces everyone to confront how costly the previous direction became. And whether intentional or not, that emotional conflict can affect how opportunities get distributed, how patience gets allocated, and how quickly narratives form around younger players competing for the future. That's why some fans are becoming increasingly protective of Shedeur Sanders already. Not because they believe he's proven himself yet. He hasn't. Not because he's unquestionably better than Watson today. Nobody honestly knows that yet either. But because many supporters are terrified the Browns may once again allow outside noise and internal pressure to distort a quarterback evaluation before the process has actually played out fairly. And if that sounds dramatic, just look at how early the third-string narrative appeared. Look at how quickly public opinion started hardening after meaningless April practices. Look at how fast speculation overtook evidence. Fans have seen this movie before. That's exactly why they're nervous now. But beneath all the emotional debate, there's one football question almost nobody seems to be asking seriously enough still. And strangely, it may end up being the most important question of the entire competition. For all the noise surrounding this quarterback competition, there's one actual football question that keeps getting buried underneath media narratives and emotional debate. And honestly, it may be the most important part of the entire story. Forget contracts for a second. Forget headlines. Forget off-season politics. The real question is simple. Which quarterback actually fits what Todd Monken wants this offense to become? Because when you really study Monken's background, the answer may not be as obvious as many people assume. Most fans instantly connect Monken to the explosive offenses he helped build in Baltimore with Lamar Jackson, but that's where the conversation often becomes too simplistic. People see Baltimore offense and immediately think mobility, improvisation, broken play magic, and quarterbacks constantly threatening defenses with their legs. And yes, Lamar Jackson absolutely transformed the geometry of football fields with his athleticism. Defenses had to account for him on every snap in ways that almost no quarterback in NFL history has ever forced them to.
But here's what gets overlooked. Monken's offenses have also heavily relied on timing, structure, spacing, fast reads, and efficient processing inside the pocket. Those systems still require quarterbacks to diagnose coverages quickly, deliver accurately in rhythm, and operate within carefully designed progression concepts. And when you start analyzing Cleveland's quarterback room through that lens, instead of pure reputation, the conversation suddenly gets much more interesting. Because stylistically, Shedeur Sanders and Deshaun Watson are very different quarterbacks. At his peak in Houston, Watson was terrifying because of his dual-threat ability. He extended plays constantly, he escaped pressure, he punished defenses after structure broke down. His athleticism changed defensive math snap after snap. That improvisational ability became a core part of what made him special. But after injuries, time away from football, and years of instability, many fans and analysts have quietly wondered whether that version of Watson still fully exists. Meanwhile, Shedeur wins in a completely different way. His game is built around timing, anticipation, pocket control, and processing. He's not the kind of quarterback defenses fear because he might suddenly turn a broken play into a 40-yard scramble. His strength comes from operating within rhythm, reading leverage quickly, and delivering accurately under structure. That style doesn't always create viral highlights, but in the right system, it can create extremely efficient football. And strangely, almost nobody seems willing to seriously discuss whether that style may actually align naturally with what Cleveland's offense is evolving toward. Instead, most of the public debate keeps revolving around status, experience, contracts, reputation. But football-wise, there's a legitimate argument that Sanders could eventually fit certain elements of Monken's offensive philosophy extremely well if developed properly, especially if the Browns want an offense emphasizing timing, spacing, quick decisions, and systematic efficiency rather than relying heavily on off-script creation.
That's not a declaration that Shedeur is already better. It's not saying Watson can't still succeed either. It's simply acknowledging that scheme fit matters far more than many people pretend. Some quarterbacks succeed because systems are designed around their strengths. Others struggle because organizations keep forcing them into structures that don't maximize what they naturally do best. And honestly, this may be where the Browns face their toughest long-term decision. Because if Shedeur truly fits the future direction of the offense more cleanly than people expect, delaying his development becomes risky. Quarterbacks improve through meaningful reps, real defensive looks, and live pressure situations. Timing-based quarterbacks especially need experience operating within the speed of NFL systems. Those developmental windows matter enormously. You can't freeze a young quarterback's growth and expect the timeline to restart perfectly later. That's why some fans are becoming increasingly frustrated with how surface-level the conversation around Sanders has become. Instead of breaking down actual scheme compatibility, most of the coverage focuses on off-season optics, body language, or who looked more comfortable during voluntary practices. Meanwhile, the deeper football discussion, the one that could actually determine Cleveland's future, barely gets explored at all. And maybe that's because the answer would force the Browns into an uncomfortable realization. Because if Shedeur truly fits the future direction of the offense more cleanly than people expect, the franchise may eventually have to choose between protecting the image of the past or fully committing to the future. And that decision could end up shaping the next era of Cleveland football entirely. The strangest part about this entire Browns quarterback saga is that almost everybody is arguing about conclusions before the real test has even begun. No meaningful games have been played, no live regular season pressure has arrived, no quarterback has stood in front of a packed stadium with the weight of an actual NFL defense trying to break the offense apart snap after snap. Yet somehow, people are already speaking with certainty about who belongs, who's failing, and who the organization supposedly trusts most. That's what makes this story so fascinating right now. Everything surrounding Shedeur Sanders has been built almost entirely on projection. Projection from media narratives, projection from fan emotions, projection from selective practice observations that happen during low-stakes off-season sessions designed primarily for teaching and installation. And somewhere along the way, those projections started hardening into truth before the evidence ever had a real chance to catch up. But football eventually exposes everything. When the lights come on for real, narratives stop mattering nearly as much. Contracts stop passing passes, headlines stop reading defenses, social media debates don't survive 3rd and long against a live pass rush in the 4th quarter. Eventually, quarterbacks have to operate under real pressure, real consequences, and real expectations. That's where reputations either collapse or become legitimate. And honestly, that may be exactly why this competition feels so volatile under the surface.
Because the Browns aren't simply deciding between two quarterbacks, they may be deciding between two entirely different futures for the franchise. One path is tied to the past, the massive investment, the public scrutiny, the pressure to justify one of the boldest quarterback decisions the organization has ever made. The other path points toward uncertainty, development, and the possibility of building something completely new around a younger player still trying to prove himself. That tension is impossible to fake. And the deeper you look into everything surrounding this situation, the harder it becomes to ignore the possibility that Shedeur Sanders may already understand the challenge better than many people around him do. The quiet off-season work, the refusal to chase attention, the focus on preparation instead of performance theater. Those aren't the habits of someone expecting shortcuts. Those are the habits of someone preparing for a long fight. Meanwhile, the public conversation keeps racing ahead of reality. People keep trying to force a final answer before training camp has truly unfolded, before preseason evaluations happen, before live bullets start flying, before coaches are forced to make difficult decisions based on actual football instead of off-season assumptions.
And history has shown over and over again that quarterback battles rarely unfold the way people expect in April. That's why the third string speculation may ultimately age very badly. Because if there's one thing this entire situation has revealed, it's that too many people became emotionally attached to a storyline before the competition even had a chance to breathe. Some already decided Watson would reclaim complete control. Others already decided Sanders was being buried unfairly. But the truth probably hasn't fully revealed itself yet. And once real football finally begins, many of the loudest offseason opinions could collapse almost overnight. The Browns may believe they're simply evaluating quarterbacks right now, but in reality, they may be determining something much larger than that. They're deciding what kind of franchise they want to become moving forward. A team still trying to protect the image of past decisions, or a team willing to recognize when a new era is trying to emerge right in front of them. And when the real pressure finally arrives, this story could look completely different from the version people think they already know today.